How wild was the Wild West? The surprising truth revealed. How wild truly was the Wild West? Were gunfights a common sight, or are they merely a creation of Hollywood and sensational novels? The answer is quite nuanced, and I even had to do some calculations to grasp it fully. Before diving deeper, it's essential to define what we mean by the Wild West. In reality, there isn't a single, clear-cut answer. It largely depends on your perspective. For example, the cowboy era, particularly concerning the significant cattle drives, was relatively brief, spanning from approximately 1865 to 1895. Similarly, the so-called Indian Wars primarily began after the Civil War, with major confrontations between Native Americans and the U.S. Army occurring until Geronimo's surrender 2 decades later. Perhaps you are considering the Mountain Men, whose time was also quite limited, roughly from 1820 to 1840. Personally, I view the Old West as encompassing the entire 19th century west of the Mississippi River. I recognize that this is a broad and somewhat simplified definition, but it serves my understanding well. The question still lingers, however. How can one assess the level of danger in the Wild West? What metrics can be used for such an evaluation? Consider the fate of fur trappers who ventured into the desolate wilderness, often disappearing without a trace. How many crows fell victim to the Blackfeet, and how many Blackfeet were lost to the Nez Perce? What were the casualty figures in the conflicts between the Comanche and the Spaniards? What were the odds of someone traversing the prairie being ambushed by hostile forces? How many homesteaders met violent ends over their land claims, with their remains never found? How frequently did outlaws engage in conflicts, leaving their victims in unmarked graves? When you factor in the gold rush, the expansion of the railroad, years of intertribal warfare, extensive human trafficking, and the westward migration to Oregon, it becomes quite challenging to ascertain just how wild or perilous the Old West truly was. Ultimately, it seems to depend on your location, the time period, and your activities. For instance, being a blacksmith in Tombstone in 1880 was likely much safer than being a fur trapper in North Dakota during the early 1820s. At least, that is my assumption. I must admit I lack concrete data to support this theory, particularly regarding blacksmiths or the situation in North Dakota during that era. However, for towns like Tombstone, Deadwood, and Dodge City, we do have some valuable insights, primarily due to a 2017 study conducted by the University of Ohio. In summary, the research revealed that while gunfights were not a common occurrence on a daily, weekly, or even monthly basis, the homicide rates during that period were significantly elevated, not only by contemporary standards but also in comparison to the overall figures across the United States in the 19th century. This study examined data from Texas, Oregon, British Columbia, several counties in Arizona, Colorado, and California, as well as 8 Native American groups in California, 5 mining towns, and 5 cattle towns, including the notorious Dodge City. While the research did not encompass every settlement west of the Mississippi, it gathered a substantial amount of information. I would like to share a brief excerpt from the study. To understand the level of violence in the West, we must consider not just the annual homicide rate, but also the long-term risk of being murdered. For example, residents of Dodge City experienced a homicide rate of at least 165 per 100,000 adults annually, translating to a 0.165% chance of being murdered each year, which is between 1/5 and 1/10%. Although this percentage may seem minor, it is significant to criminologists and epidemiologists, as it indicates that an adult living in Dodge City from 1876 to 1885 had at least a 1 in 61 chance of being murdered, with 1.65% of the population falling victim over that decade. In contrast, an adult residing in San Francisco from 1850 to 1865 faced at least a 1 in 203 chance of murder. In the 8 other California counties studied, the risk was at least 1 in 72. Even in Oregon, from 1850 to 1865, which recorded the lowest minimum rate in the American West at 30 per 100,000 adults per year, the chance of being murdered was still 1 in 208. For context, as of this recording, the current chance of becoming a victim of violent crime in present-day Dodge City, Kansas, is 1 in 247, encompassing all forms of violent crime, not just homicide. The current murder rate stands at 0.04%, significantly lower than the 0.165% recorded in Dodge City during the latter part of the 19th century. This indicates that, based solely on murder statistics, Dodge City, Kansas, is less violent and less lethal in 2024 than it was during its peak as a notorious cow town. However, this observation pertains specifically to Dodge City. What about other locations? Referring back to the study, it states that if we consider the towns and counties examined thus far to be representative of similar areas, and their residents a fair sample of those in comparable towns or counties, we can reasonably conclude, based on probability laws, that homicide rates were likely elevated in towns and counties not yet studied. For example, if the 5 cattle towns analyzed are typical, there is only a 1 in 200 chance that the homicide rate across all western cattle towns was below 97 per 100,000 adults annually. The likelihood that the rate in all cattle towns was low or moderate by the standards of most other regions in the United States and Western nations, 10 per 100,000 adults per year or less, is exceedingly slim. Delving deeper, let's again consider Dodge City. In 1880, the homicide rate in Dodge City was 100.4 per 100,000 residents, while the national homicide rate in the United States for 2016 was just 5.3 per 100,000. These figures suggest that Dodge was exceptionally violent in 1880. However, it's important to note that only 1 murder occurred in Dodge that year. The twist is that the population at the time was merely 996 individuals. Thus, that single homicide inflated the murder rate from 0 per 100,000 to 100 per 100,000. Even in Dodge's most violent year, there were only 5 murders recorded. Historian Marshall Trimble notes that between 1870 and 1875, the combined total of violent deaths in the cow towns of Dodge, Abilene, Ellsworth, Wichita, and Caldwell was merely 45. In contrast, historian Randolph Roth reports that Gila County, Arizona, recorded a staggering rate of 156 homicides per 100,000 residents from 1880 to 1884. Body, California, followed with a rate of 116 per 100,000, while the boomtown of Deadwood surpassed them all, experiencing a homicide rate of 442 per 100,000 adults within its first 7 months. Tombstone presents a similar narrative. During its most violent year, it recorded only 5 violent deaths, akin to Dodge City. In stark contrast, Houston, Texas, reported 344 murders in 2023. The significant difference lies in population size. Houston boasts over 2.3 million residents, while Tombstone had just 973 inhabitants in 1880. While I may not be a statistician, I utilized an online calculator to assess homicide rates. Based on the figures provided, Houston's murder rate in 2023 stands at 14 per 100,000. Conversely, when applying the same calculator to Tombstone's 1880 data, despite only 5 killings, the murder rate was considerably higher. To illustrate, with a population of 973 and 5 homicides, Tombstone's murder rate calculates to an alarming 513 per 100,000 residents, compared to Houston's 14 per 100,000. This comparison highlights a striking reality. As of now, New Orleans holds the highest murder rate in the United States at 58.4 per 100,000 residents, yet this figure remains significantly lower than Tombstone's rate in 1880, despite the latter's mere 5 killings. I hope this explanation is clear. While it's true that there are significantly more murders today in cities like New Orleans and Houston, when you consider the populations of historical towns such as Dodge City and Tombstone, the likelihood of dying a violent death was actually higher in those times than it is now, assuming I interpret these statistics correctly. Mathematics isn't my forte, which is why I'm relying on a calculator. For an interesting comparison, let's look at Tombstone in 1880 alongside present-day Colima, Mexico. According to Statistica.com, Colima currently holds the title of the deadliest city in the world, with a murder rate of 140.2 per 100,000 residents. Given my earlier comments about math and my limited knowledge of statistics, it appears that Colima, while nearly 2.5 times more dangerous than modern New Orleans, still does not reach the violent levels seen in Tombstone and Deadwood during their peak periods. Additionally, I came across a study on frontier crime statistics by political economist Matthew Coutinier. He notes that much of the violence in the Old West was concentrated in areas with scarce resources, such as mining towns like Tombstone and cattle towns like Dodge City. Even during the Range Wars, the conflicts were primarily over limited resources like grass and water. To quote Mr. Coutinier, there was a 3 to 4% increase in crime in counties rich in minerals and lacking federal oversight compared to those without mineral resources that were incorporated into the United States. Furthermore, it's important to consider the demographics of the Old West. According to the 1880 U.S. Census, men aged 18 to 25 constituted the majority of the frontier population. It may not come as a surprise, but young men aged 18 to 25 tend to exhibit a higher propensity for violence and risky behavior. This age group continues to account for a significant portion of homicides today. In essence, the context of time and location plays a crucial role in understanding these dynamics. Consider a mining town with scarce resources, predominantly inhabited by young men in that age bracket. Such a place would likely be more hazardous compared to more developed cities like Austin or St. Louis. Contrary to cinematic portrayals, gunfights were not as prevalent as often depicted. In fact, many towns in the Old West had regulations prohibiting the carrying of firearms within city limits. However, statistics reveal a stark reality. In certain locations such as Tombstone, Deadwood, and Dodge City, the murder rates during the Old West era were significantly higher than those in the rest of the United States at that time, and even exceeded the rates of today's most violent cities. This discussion was prompted by a question from listener Sifa Randwide on YouTube, who shared insights about an old mining town in Utah called Eureka, reputed to be a peaceful and civilized place. In contrast, other nearby towns reportedly experienced an average of 2 murders per day. While it's challenging to ascertain accurate figures, it raises the question of how frequent murders truly were in such towns. Were they genuinely a daily occurrence, or has this been exaggerated over time? If you're still tuned in, I hope this provides some clarity on the homicide rates in the Old West. While certain areas were indeed quite dangerous, many places were not as perilous as their reputations suggest, and the narratives surrounding these towns have often been greatly exaggerated. I am reminded of a location I researched some time ago called Canyon Diablo. Today it stands as a ghost town, but legend has it that Canyon Diablo was one of the most notorious places in the West. It originated as a railroad town and quickly became populated with numerous saloons, brothels, and gambling establishments, all serving the rail workers and the usual assortment of criminals attracted to such remote areas. To illustrate the perilous nature of Canyon Diablo, The first town marshal was sworn in at 3 p.m. and was buried by 8 p.m. the same day. Additionally, the local Boot Hill Cemetery reportedly contained 36 graves, with 35 attributed to violent deaths. At least that is the tale that has been passed down. In truth, there is no concrete evidence to support these claims. They stem from the creativity of a fiction writer named Gladwell Richardson. Nevertheless, this has not deterred people from recounting these stories repeatedly. Over time, many have come to believe that Canyon Diablo, with its intriguing name, was also one of the most dangerous towns in the Old West. There was indeed a notable shootout in Canyon Diablo in 1905 that resulted in one fatality, but I am not aware of any other gunfights taking place there, nor do I have evidence to back up the other assertions. So it's wise to approach these tales with caution. There were certainly regions in the Old West where life expectancy could significantly decrease, but most of the narratives are simply that, narratives. Thank you for tuning in. If you are a new listener to the Wild West Extravaganza, this is the show where we delve into all aspects of Old West history. Typically, each episode centers on a specific individual or event from the Wild West, but today, I thought I would switch things up a bit and address a few listener inquiries. The next question comes from Brandon Davis, 6078, who asks, "Do you think cowboys on the trail or in a bunkhouse share toenail clippers?" My answer, Brandon, is no, and I will explain why. I believe that pocket knives are commonly used by individuals to groom both their fingernails and toenails, much like my father does. In my view, a true cowboy would never be without a pocket knife, nor would they ever lower themselves to ask to borrow one from someone else. On a serious note, I think this could be an intriguing subject for Santee on the Arizona Ghost Riders channel over on YouTube. Regarding the historical use of toenail clippers in bunkhouses, I must admit I have no information on that. My apologies. Moving on, we have the Banjo Outlaw inquiring about Billy the Kid. He mentioned, "Let's discuss the Indian note that Billy the Kid allegedly left in a shell casing inside a cave. I believe it was written on cigarette paper. I haven't found much more information on it aside from a brief mention in Bob Bowes Bell's book." In response, Banjo Outlaw, you might already be aware, but I have an episode dedicated to this note titled Billy the Kid's Last Stand, which you can find linked below if you're interested in listening. For those unfamiliar with the topic, Banjo is referring to a note that was discovered several decades ago, possibly in the 1940s or 1950s. It was written on cigarette paper, rolled up, and placed inside an empty cartridge. The note read, "This is our last shell and about 10 Indians left, so our chances look slim, but we are going to take a chance. Yours truly, William Bonney." While I find the note fascinating, I remain skeptical about whether it can be definitively attributed to Billy the Kid. Although the handwriting appears to match, its authenticity remains uncertain. Nonetheless, it's an interesting thought, and according to online sources, it sold at auction in 2019 for an impressive $3,025. Now, addressing a question I've received multiple times over the past few years, Exclusive Man X1046 has asked if I play RDR2. Unfortunately, I must say that I do not, but I do have a desire to try it out. For those who may not be familiar, RDR2 stands for Red Dead Redemption 2, a video game that Wikipedia describes as a 2018 action-adventure title developed and published by Rockstar Games. This game is the third installment in the Red Dead series and serves as a prequel to the 2010 release Red Dead Redemption. Set in a fictionalized version of the United States in 1899, the narrative follows Arthur Morgan, an outlaw and member of the Vanderland Gang, as he navigates the waning days of the Wild West while contending with government forces, rival gangs, and various other threats. Reflecting on my past, I used to be quite passionate about video games, enjoying titles like Halo, Call of Duty, and Grand Theft Auto. However, around 2008 or 2009, I found that the enjoyment faded. I want to clarify that I'm not one of those people who claim to have outgrown gaming. It's simply that, for reasons I can't pinpoint, it became less engaging for me. Additionally, I must admit that I was never particularly skilled at gaming. When I played online with friends and colleagues, I often found myself on the losing end of battles. At that time, Red Dead Redemption 2 had not yet been released, and by the time it did, I didn't even own a gaming console. Currently, I still do not have one. However, I've heard rumors of a third installment in the series, and I might consider purchasing a PlayStation when it comes out to explore the game. Ultimately, it boils down to having enough free time, which I currently lack. That said, I plan to make it a priority this year to at least watch a playthrough of Red Dead Redemption 2, including all the cutscenes, to familiarize myself with the storyline, which I've heard is quite compelling. Lastly, I have a question that's been on my mind. The inquiry originates from DKim8164, who poses the question, would you prefer to confront an enraged brown bear armed with a Bowie knife or a tomahawk? The unequivocal answer is the Bowie knife. With a tomahawk, my only feasible approach would be to strike the bear on the head, or, if fortunate, perhaps manage to sever a paw. In contrast, wielding a Bowie knife would allow me to engage more effectively and inflict significant damage. While victory may be unlikely, indeed, it is probably out of reach, I am determined to ensure that the bear experiences some discomfort for a few days. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more interesting histories.